I also acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I recognise the importance of country, community and culture. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Tonight we will hear Professor Ross Garnaut, then open the floor for questions and answers, which will be by chat. And then Professor Frank Bongiorno will officially thank Professor Garnaut and we'll finish around 7 p.m. Please mute your microphones and be sure to write your questions in chat, and I'll read the questions in the order that I get them. And you can write those in chat at any stage. So, Professor Ross Garnaut. Ross is an Emeritus Professor in Economics at the Australian National University and an Emeritus Professor in Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne. Over the past 50 years, he has had many senior roles in business and as a policy advisor and diplomat. Ross was the Senior Economic Policy Official in Papua New Guinea's Department of Finance in the years straddling independence in 1975. Principal Economic Advisor to Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke from 1983 to 1985, and Australian Ambassador to China from 1985 to 1988. He was awarded a Companion of the Order of Australia in 2017 for the work on climate change and energy, and an Officer in the Order of Australia in 1993 for services to education and international relations. He is an author of numerous publications in scholarly journals on international economics, public finance, and economic development, particularly in relation to East Asia and Southwest Pacific. His recent books include Superpower, Australia's Low Carbon Opportunity, Black Ink in 2019, and Reset, Restoring Australia After the Pandemic Recession 2021. Ross is a Distinguished Fellow of the Australian Economic Society, Distinguished Life Member of the Australian Agricultural and Resources Economic Society, Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, and Honorary Professor of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He is now Director of Zen Energy and Director of Re-Energy. On behalf of Sebastian Clark, President of Manning Clark House, who cannot be with us today, I now welcome Professor Ross Garnaut.
Very good to be with you and to remember a great Australian. Canberra and the ANU were young and small when I got to know Manning. I was a 17-year-old lad from WA and could handle a footy. He was what one might call a blues tragic. Like his contemporaries, Bob Menzies and Bob Santamaria, with whom he shared a great Australian faith and solemn ritual occasions, he had formed his allegiance with Carlton from the University of Melbourne. The ANU football team, like Carlton, was the blues, so he could pretend that watching the ball bounce off the hard clay near Sullivan's Creek was something like the old paddock in Jolimont. Manning would delight us at footy club dinners with speeches that shocked with invocations of the basest Australian spirits and stories from their hopes and fears. This would have been a painful week for Manning before the football finals, with Carlton knocked out in the last minute after a battle of the ages with Collingwood. But an epic, heroic old Australian failure, like the Anzacs, Ned Kelly and Gough Whitlam. But he would find solace in the memory of coming from well behind in the third quarter to beat Collingwood on the last Saturday in September in 1970. As he said in the long front page article in The Age on that same day in 1981, the morning of another game against Collingwood. I quote from The Age, the front page, Manning Clark's article. It is possible that scores will be level as the game enters the time-on period in the last quarter. Then none of the wisdom of the ages will help, saying to myself, be still, my soul. It will only be for a moment. That does not help. Nothing helps except the siren, and that seems like an eternity away. Volume 1 of The Big History had come out not long before I first met Manning. A buzz of excitement would run amongst my friends.
Hello, Peter Macaulay.
If the sun was shining when Manning and I bumped into each
Peter
other,
Macaulay.
walking down University Avenue, I would raise some questions about it and we would chat. Later on, we both spoke over the open grave of a mutual friend, Alan Manning, as the historian plucked a eucalypt twig from an adjacent tree and placed it on the coffin in the ground. Manning Clark is our Homer, our Genesis, and our Shakespeare. None was the final word on fact, but all told their tribes what it was to be their sort of human. When I want to be there, when they come to know what it had all been for, I can't be sure whether I am remembering Dostoevsky or Manning Clark's rendition of the thought. Manning loved the enlarger who stood by his vision and in the end could not quite overcome the hopelessness of the human condition. Old white Australia's story, he thought, was bound to failure by the harshness of nature on this ancient continent. On the 7:30 report with Paul Lynham and Bill Gamage for the 75th anniversary of the landing at Gallipoli, he tied that idea to our idealization of the Anzac story. Defeat would be the outcome. By being true to ourselves and our mates, the tragedy could be borne. In the short essay in Making History in 1985, he expressed, quote, regret that in presenting a tragic vision of life, that I unwittingly muted that voice hoping for better things for humanity. Writing in the tragic vein, you have to be very careful not to be counselling resignation and acceptance. I think Manning did counsel resignation more than our true chances warrant. If the enforcer is motivated by the enlarger's vision, the enforcer's calculation of the odds can avoid heroic failure and win success. Whitlam and Hawke came after Volume 6, so we can't be sure what he would have written about them as history. But Manning loved Whitlam's heroic vision and his tragic end. In Manning's Eye of Pity, Hawke's success in enlarging ordinary life for ordinary Australians may, I suspect, have been evidence that he had compromised the vision. Manning was certainly right when he said that every individual life fails, but humanity can succeed. That is the truth. No one achieves all of the good for humanity for which they hope, or even what they might actually have achieved. But by doing the best they can, many people make things better for those who follow. For all of the tragedy of Ethiopia, Somalia, Ukraine, the decaying governance of our Southwest Pacific neighborhood, of Xinjiang, of Trump's Supreme Court and continuing insurrection, the majority of humans now live better lives than 80, 800, or 8,000 years ago. And that is because enlargers taught and died on the cross, planned against the odds to defeat the might of great states and persuaded democratic electorates to take a risk with something good. And it is also because enforcers calculated and played the odds. What greater enlarger has there been in modern times than Abraham Lincoln? He respected the odds and played them with careful calculation. When advised that early proclamation of freedom from slavery would bring God on the side of the Union, he calculated the odds and the consequences of losing the border slave states that had stayed with the nation. I hope to have God, he said, but I must have Kentucky. This evening, I discussed Australian leaders seeking to make life better for the mass of their compatriots in hard times. In Volume 6, Manning told the story of the New Scullin Labor government elected as the Great Depression descended upon our country, of the government's destruction by inability to respond cohesively to overwhelming force. He loved Scullin, the man of generous faith who abjured apostasy. Manning wrote of Theodore, Deputy Prime Minister and Treasurer, as a compromise figure with his interests in personal wealth before and beyond Volume 6 after public office. Theodore stood down at an early and critical time in response to unproven allegations of corruption that were later rejected at law. He returned to the diminishing Labor fold and developed the response with fiduciary funding of public expenditure and currency depreciation that economists today recognize as the most likely path to success, to no avail. The Great Depression scarred but taught important lessons to leaders who had been defeated by it, most importantly, John Curtin and Ben Chifley. As wartime Prime Minister and Treasurer, rallying and organising Australians for the defence of their country, they were determined that Australians would never return to the unemployment and misery that had been the fate of many in the 1930s. Their vision of better lives for all Australians was enforced by the analysis and rigour of the Department of Post-War Reconstruction and the 1945 White Paper on Full Employment. What followed was a quarter century of full employment with rising living standards, and after a brief burst of high inflation at the beginning of Menzies' long reign, low inflation. Success came from the vision of the enlargers and the effective support of the enforcers. It grew from building policy on foundations of economic analysis and knowledge, making equitable distribution of benefits of growth a central objective, expanding public knowledge of the policy choices, and protecting the national interest in policy from vested and other private interests. Menzies succeeded politically, first of all, because he retained the Curtin-Chifley focus on full employment. The leading enforcers from the old Department of Post-War Reconstruction retained major public sector roles into the 1960s. The full employment with low inflation and rising incomes was followed by a decade of entrenched higher unemployment and inflation. This ended with the election of the Hawke government. The reform era from 1983 to the end of the century gave Australia its best decade ever of productivity growth relative to other developed countries in the 1990s, and then the longest period of economic expansion unbroken by recession ever in any developed country, ending in the pandemic recession of 2020. While the content of policy was different, the success of the late 20th century reform era was built on the same elements as post-war reconstruction. It was built on articulation of an inclusive vision of a prosperous and fair society in which equitable distribution was a centrally important objective. It was based on sound economic analysis, prepared to break the boundaries of orthodoxy if an alternative path was shown to be better. It's based on public education as a means of building support for difficult change. It was based on preparedness to hold firm for the public interest against vested and sectional interests. It was based on effective use of a professional public service. These were the two periods when Australian governments faced up to large problems for the welfare of ordinary Australians and set the country on a better path. In my 2021 book, Reset, Restoring Australia After the Pandemic Recession, I contrasted these episodes of successful reform followed by a long period of broadly based prosperity with the failures of the 1920s and the decade between post-war reconstruction and the Hawke reform era. Reset noted that the 28 years of continuous economic growth that ended in 2020 were not continuous or even. In the first decade, strong economic growth was based on productivity, and that was a sustainable source of rising incomes. In the second decade of that long expansion, average incomes of Australians continued to grow quite strongly, but with relatively low productivity growth. This was the China resources boom, in which greatly increased prices for our exports and opportunities for investment in export industries supported rising incomes through restructuring of the economy to meet rapidly growing demand as the world's most populous country entered the strongest and longest period of economic growth the world has seen. And then after that, the China resources boom ended about 2012. We entered a period up until the pandemic recession that I call the dog days. That was in anticipation, that was the name I gave this period in my book, Dog Days, Australia After the Boom, published in 2013. Unfortunately, it was prophetic. In the dog days, 2013 to 2019, productivity output and incomes grew much lower than other OECD countries, lower even than Japan, which Australians at the time thought of was a bit of an economic basket case. During this period, we started with much lower unemployment than the United States because we'd had a good global financial crisis. We didn't have a recession in the global financial crisis. So we started the dog days with unemployment around 5.5%. And the US then, in those years after the global financial crisis, had unemployment nearly twice as high. But by the end of the dog days, we were stuck with high unemployment, 5.5%. And United States unemployment had fallen well below ours to 3.5%. During these years, not only do we have much higher unemployment than other developed countries with which we like to compare ourselves, we had rapidly rising underemployment. I discussed in my book Reset a number of the causes of the underperformance in the dog days. Monetary policy mistakes that prevented us making progress towards full employment. A change in our approach to immigration, where we allowed relatively free immigration of temporary workers, people who were not on a path to being Australians, a radical change in the 21st century from the basis of Australian immigration policy in the post-war period. And that had the effect of meeting rising demand for labour whenever it occurred, so that there was no reflection in increased wages. There were important distortions from vested interests, including those that led to the removal of carbon pricing and serious corruption of the taxation system that diminished our capacity to raise public revenue in non-distorting ways. And there was a period of increasing difficulty in honest and accurate discussion of public policy. The new media, the information technology, and the role of News Corp in Australian discussion all had an important effect on distortion of information in public policy discussion. When the pandemic hit, it sent the Australian, like all economies, quickly into deep recession. In 2020, the first half of 2020, we had the first decline in output in successive quarters that we'd had for 28 years. We responded with a radical change of fiscal and monetary policy, rapid expansion of public expenditure, well-directed on, some of it well-directed towards low-income people. We had a radical change in the stance of monetary policy, whereas our monetary policy had been tighter than other developed countries, even when our economy had been weaker during the dog days. We moved closer to the monetary policy stance of other developed countries. This and the closure of our borders to immigration led us for the first time to make, in a very long time, to make rather large steps in the direction of full employment, with unemployment going down to 3.4% in the most recent month, July. People wonder about why wages are rising. There had been an expectation that at full employment, real wages would rise in Australia after a decade of stagnation. There is no conundrum. The reason is simply that we didn't reach full employment. And now we see that the Reserve Bank of Australia has given up on full employment before we've got there. So we don't know, and we may not know at this time in history, what full employment might have looked like. I just recall back to those days of post-war reconstruction, the public service leaders of that, the economists like Coombs and Crawford, didn't know either when they set out to create a set of policies that would give Australia full employment, and they were surprised. that for 20 years, unemployment averaged a touch below 2% without inflation. There's no very good reason why we couldn't hold out hopes, if not expectations, of moving much closer to that now. The pandemic recession was an opportunity to reset other policies, not only fiscal and monetary policies. It was an opportunity to start to get right many of the things that had gone wrong in the dog days and to set Australia up for a new period of sustained growth and prosperity. They were the set of issues that I addressed in the book Reset. But fundamental change would have been required. It required new approach to fiscal policy, but there had already been changes there. It required a continuing new approach to monetary policy, in particular, not keeping interest rates higher and monetary policy tighter than the rest of the world when our economy wasn't stronger than the rest of the world. There were some very big blockages on the way of economic growth in the new circumstances through the long expansion of 28 years. Export growth and investment in the export industries had been very important, but we faced big blockages with breakdown in the international trading system to a significant extent, the result of initiatives of the Trump presidency, the breakdown of our trade relations with China, and the recognition that the world was not going to be provide a growing market for our second and third largest export industries, coal and gas, because of concern for climate change. Recognition that these industries, which have been important sources of growth in the 21st century, had to decline eventually to zero. So there were some very big headwinds, especially in the international sphere, and questions about whether even with resetting policy, we would have the international base, the export base, to enter a period of renewed growth and prosperity. I think that, and that would have been a very big story if it was not for recognition in Australia of an advantage that emerged over the past decade. And that's Australia's opportunity to be the energy superpower of the zero emissions world economy. It became clear by late last year that the coalition government was not going to use the opportunity to reset Australian policy and grasp the new opportunities. But the election result in May represented a change in the Australian political landscape of immense dimension, one that made things possible that hadn't been possible before. It wasn't the usual oscillation between Conservative and Labor that had been that had provided the framework for Australian politics ever since the fusion of free trade and protection parties under Deakin way back in the first decade of our national story. This was something bigger. I think that the flushing out the loss of Conservative support in what had been their mainstream electorates in the richer parts of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and Perth represents a rather fundamental change. And it together with the election of a Labor majority government, it provided a political base for changes in economic policy and in integrity that had the potential to make things that had been impossible possible. So that's the opportunity faced by the new parliament and the new government. There was a reset opportunity that had been partially grasped, and that partial grasping had taken us a step closer to full employment than we'd been for 50 years, but otherwise opportunities were letting go to waste. There was a chance of a reset. History throws up all sorts of curved balls, and whatever difficulty there was going to be in an Australian reset were greatly complicated by the Russian war. The Russian invasion of Ukraine disrupted global energy markets, and the way we set up our energy markets meant that the increase in international prices came directly back into Australian prices. And so we were in the rather paradoxical position that we were the world's biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas and of coal. There was a big increase in the global price of coal and gas because Russia invaded the Ukraine, and what had been very large volumes of coal and gas exports and oil from Russia were no longer able to find their way onto European markets. Europe was looking for other sources. The terms of trade of gas and coal importing countries went deeply against them, and this is a source of a big loss of income in Western Europe, in Japan, and Korea. The terms of trade of Australia actually increased with higher gas and coal prices, but the standard of living of ordinary Australians fell proportionately, not all that differently, to those in Western Europe. This is a paradoxical situation, one that many Australians would find difficult to understand, and if they understood it, difficult to accept. It's a function of the way we link our gas and coal prices to international prices, and they flow back into electricity prices. There's an awry similarity to the way that the Russian war suddenly triggered changes that left to themselves would very substantially reduce the Australian standard of living. Awry similarity to that happening in the very first days of this Labor government to what happened to Scullin back in 1929. The Scullin government was sworn in on October the 22nd, 1929, and the biggest, what up to that point had been the biggest one-day fall on the New York Stock Exchange, occurred just 2 days later on October the 24th, presaging the onset of the Great Depression. In the Scullin government never recovered from that. It's of course of crucial importance to the prospects of Australia that the new government elected in May is able to understand the big international forces playing on it, on the Australian economy, and manage in that context in a way that resets Australia at first for maintenance of the standard of living and then for broadly based growth. That's the big challenge of the period ahead. A lot of the ideas in the book Reset, and I don't have one on my desk to hand up, but I noticed that Peter Macaulay is doing that. That's what it looks like. Thank you, Peter. I think a lot of the ideas in Reset are very relevant to what is necessary in current circumstances. But it can't be the whole story because I didn't, when I wrote Reset, I did not anticipate the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what that would do to world energy markets. So the new government has to, and the new parliament have to deal with all of the challenges I discussed in Reset, and one more big one, insulating the Australian standard of living from those very large increases in coal, gas, and therefore electricity prices. monetary orthodoxy as it's developed in the 21st century leads to a fairly automatic increase in, or at least a knee-jerk tendency towards increase in interest rates when the rate of inflation measured by the CPI and other broad-based indexes rises. And we've seen that happening in recent times. I was a little bit worried when a rather rigid approach to inflation targeting began to emerge in the early 21st century, and I gave a talk to the Economic Society in Canberra at the end of 2005 that I called Is Macroeconomics Dead? And was published as a paper later in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy. But I said there that there was some danger of an inflation standard replacing the gold standard as a source of rigidity in monetary policy. You can see some of the risks now that if we continue to raise interest rates, tighten monetary policy, because inflation is higher than the target range, then we will diminish demand for many goods and services in ways that seriously disrupts the economy, leads not for movement closer to full employment, but to rising unemployment. That would be a dreadful mistake, and we have to think about how we can avoid it. The blessing in the current situation is that truncating the unnecessary increase in energy prices at a time when the economy generally is slowing may give the Reserve Bank the rationale to change the monetary policy stance, and that leads to the need for a focus on driving a wedge between international and domestic coal and gas prices. In thinking about these issues, the awful similarities of the energy crisis from the Russian war reaching Australia in the week of swearing in of a new government, I have an awful echo in my head of the fate of the Scullin government, but I think we understand the important economic relationships now better than Jim Scullin and his team did. We've got the knowledge to do better. I also have an echo in my head of the worst ever era of British monetary policy. The Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, Winston Churchill, followed conventional advice on return to the gold standard at the pre-war parity in 1925, when the massive monetary expansion to fund British participation in the war rendered acceptance of higher post-war prices inevitable and a necessary part of the adjustment. With this echo in my head, I picked up John Maynard Keynes' essay, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. This essay was initially 3 newspaper articles, commencing straight after the Chancellor's announcement that he was returning the country to sound money as advised by the Bank of England and the City of London. I'll just read a few sentences from Keynes' concluding paragraphs, which, as I said, was initially 3 newspaper articles, but later came out as an essay and then published in Keynes' collection, Essays in Persuasion. And I quote from the end of that essay: "The monetary policy announced in the 1925 budget being the real source of our industrial troubles, it is impossible to recommend any truly satisfactory course except its reversal. Nevertheless, amongst the alternatives still open to this government, some courses are better than others. One course is to pursue the so-called sound policy vigorously, with the objective of bringing about the fundamental adjustments in the orthodox way by further restricting credit and raising the bank rate in the autumn if necessary, thus intensifying unemployment and using every other weapon in our hands to force down money wages. If this policy can be carried through, it will be, in a sense, successful, though it will leave much injustice behind it on account of the inequality of the changes it will effect. The question is how far public opinion will allow such a policy to go. It will be politically impossible for the government to admit that it was deliberately intensifying unemployment. Deflation, once started ever so little, is cumulative in its progress. If pessimism becomes generally prevalent in the business world, the slower circulation of money resulting from this can carry deflation a long way further, without the bank having either to raise the bank rate or to reduce its deposits. And since the public always understands particular causes better than general causes, the depression will be attributed to the industrial disputes which will accompany it, or to the Dawes scheme, or to China, or to the inevitable consequences of the Great War, or to tariffs, or to high taxation, or to anything in the world except the general monetary policy which has set the whole thing going. A furtive, and continue with the quote from Keynes, a furtive restriction of credit by the Bank of England can be coupled with vague cogitations on the part of Mr. Baldwin, who has succeeded to the position in our affections formerly occupied by Queen Victoria, as to whether social benevolence does not require him to neutralise the effects of this by a series of illogical subsidies. The budgetary position will render it impossible for the subsidies to be big enough to make any real difference. And in the end, unless there's a social upheaval, the fundamental adjustment will really take place. Some people may contemplate this forecast with equanimity. I do not. It involves a great loss of social income whilst it is going on, and will leave behind much social injustice when it is finished. The best, indeed the only hope, lies in the possibility that in this world, where so little can be foreseen, something may turn up. Which leads me to my alternative suggestions. Still Keynes, could we not help something to turn up? Well, I conclude with, by noting that the economic summit the day after tomorrow is a chance to help something turn up. And then back to the beginning of the story. Manning wrote in The Age, in that article in 1981, on the morning of that last Saturday of September, Collingwood again in the path. Quote, if the game is close, there may be more than I can endure in my season of the sear and the yellow leaf, as the Carlton players make me feel as though my love has come to me. For the record, on that last day in September 1981, Carlton was again way behind in the third quarter and won by a similar margin to 11 years before in the 1970 grand final. Manning's love had come to him.
Thank you, Professor Garnaut. That was awesome. I loved the AFL speak. We do have a couple of questions. And again, I'll remind everybody that if you'd like to ask Professor Garnaut any questions, please pop it in the chat. The first question is from John Mitchell, who is a committee member of the Manning Clark House Committee. He asks, do you think the government should relent and stop the third stage of tax cuts?
Well, I agreed with the opposition when it thought those tax cuts were a bad idea and opposed them. And I don't see any reason to have changed my mind. Now, the fact that they were legislated and the government said before the election that it wouldn't unlegislate them is another fact the government has to take into account. The prospects of reaction to a broken explicit promise. There is an answer to that, of course. I go back to John Maynard Keynes again. He quoted as saying, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? Well, one very big fact has changed, and that is the disruption of the global and Australian economy as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In the post-election forecast that was put out just ahead of the election campaign, after the calling of the election, it was put out in the names of the Treasurer and the Finance Minister, but these are documents prepared by the Treasury and the Department of Finance. They look forward to a fairly bleak couple of years for the Australian standard of living for the financial year that's just been completed, which was only partway completed at the time the document came out, and the financial year we're in. Over those 2 years, they contemplated consumer prices rising 3 percentage points more than the standard index of wages, real wages falling by 3%. Well, that's very unusual in Australia, almost without parallel. Well, the facts changed. At the end of July, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Treasurer put out a news statement, an economic statement, in which he would have had advice from the Treasury, but it's the Treasurer's statement, that redid those forecasts, and that they already knew then better than 3 months before how big the fall in real wages was going to be last year. And that was going to be 3.5%. Well, once we knew this consumer price index, we saw that was 3.5% just in that quarter. And those forecasts in that year, and the forecasts that were put forward at the end of July foreshadow another reduction in real wages of 3.5% in the current financial year. That would add up to 7% reduction in 2 years. I can safely say that there's never been anything like that in Australian history. The facts have changed. Maybe we should think about changing our minds.
Excellent, thank you. So Professor Bongiorno asks, what of the Reserve Bank of Australia? Does it need to be reformed? If so, how?
Well, I think there's quite a lot to be said for an independent Reserve Bank. So that wouldn't be the reform I'd be focusing on. Just because it's independent doesn't mean to say it shouldn't be criticized when it's wrong. In fact, it's more important for people who think about these things to criticize them when they're wrong if they're independent than if not. In fact, the only accountability comes from open and independent criticism of them when they're wrong. So I think their ideas about monetary policy need reform, and that should come from criticism and accountability through people drawing attention to mistakes and normal consequences following from that. But in Reset, I suggested that whereas 30 years ago, in the early 1990s, entrenched inflation was the big macroeconomic problem. And there was a case for independence of the Reserve Bank because the Reserve Bank had to do some very hard things, raising interest rates in difficult circumstances to lower inflation. I suggested that in Reset that what we need now is an independent authority looking at overall demand and not just monetary policy, playing a role in fiscal and monetary policy, not the detail of which taxes to raise and lower, which expenditures to introduce, but having some role in fiscal policy and, for example, being able to raise or lower overall tax rates in response to the macroeconomic situation. Because for reasons I set out in Reset, I think there's more reason to be concerned about the need for independence in overall demand policy than just monetary policy. So that's certainly one reform that I have in mind. But I think that a high degree of independence in that exercise of policy is still a good idea, but with a different focus. And then all of us have duties as citizens to criticize an independent authority when it's wrong.
Excellent, thank you. So this question is from Andrew Walter. There are a number of ways of driving a wedge between international and domestic energy prices. What is the best way and what is the most likely way?
Well, I discussed this in my Gruen lecture a couple of months ago, a lecture in honor of Fred Gruen at the ANU. And well, there's two broad ways in which we could protect the Australian standard of living from the transmission of very high global coal and gas prices back into Australian gas and electricity prices in ways that reduce real wages and the standard of living in Australia. Two broad ways are driving a wedge between international and domestic prices and taxing windfall profits and using those profits to make payments to Australian households and where appropriate businesses to insulate them from the increased prices arising out of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And they are very big increases in prices. So there's two broad ways: driving the wedge between international and domestic prices, or taxing profits resulting from the war, from the invasion. The advantage of driving the wedge is that you put down prices. And if the Reserve Bank is determined to keep raising interest rates when Russian invasion of countries leads to higher prices for our exports, then we short circuit the process of easing monetary policy by stopping prices rising by as much. So stopping the high international prices getting into Australian prices is the big advantage of the wedge over a tax on windfall profits. Two ways of driving that wedge. One would be to restrict exports to an extent that kept domestic prices at levels that would have existed without the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The other would be to put an export levy on coal and gas, taking the difference between the price prior to Russian invasion. Both of these, either of these methods could work. Domestic reservation requiring more gas from export industries to be supplied to the domestic market, been very successful in stabilising, holding down prices in Western Australia. It is one approach here, be more difficult for coal than for gas because there are a lot more players. There's just 3 liquefied natural gas exporters in Eastern Australia, so it would be an easier matter to reserve gas for the domestic market. If the major exporters were wise, I think they would be taking their own steps towards diversion of of restraint in exporting in very high prices to international markets, putting more on the domestic market and holding down prices themselves, and we wouldn't be holding this discussion. Either increased domestic supplies or a levy on exports would do the job. Each has merits and administrative difficulties. I've mentioned in the Gruen lecture both possibilities. I'd let the people who would have to administer the scheme in government work out which is best.
Thank you, Professor Garnaut. We have another question from Stephen. Ross, thank you for your talk and book. Returning to taxes, given Labor's promises in relation to services, aged care, healthcare, etc., should we be aiming to increase the tax/GDP ratio?
Oh, I don't think Australia can return to broadly based prosperity without a substantial increase in the tax to GDP ratio. The ratio in Australia is 5.7 percentage points below the average for the OECD, and I can't see a very good reason for that. Tax is what you pay to live in a civilized society, and a lot of those services are necessary in a civilized society. Some other countries developed democracies have put themselves in a better position than us to provide a civilized life for all of our people. Now, what happened to the political culture of Australia in the last 7 or 8 years can't be wished away. The last 9 or 10 years, the government did make certain promises on taxation, but as I said before, the facts have changed, and we should at least consider changing our mind.
Thank you, Professor Garnaut. I would now like to hand over to Professor Frank Bongiorno, all these professors tonight. So over to you, Frank.
Well, thank you very much, and what a splendid lecture. So, thanks, Ross, for all of those stimulating things you've said tonight. Manning Clark said he was weak on backdrop in his histories, weak on backdrop. And by backdrop, of course, Manning meant exactly the kinds of things that Ross has been talking about tonight. He meant the economy, he meant all of the kind of material factors that are so important in, I guess, helping to produce that civilised society that Ross just referred to in relation to taxation. That said, I mean, Ross has made, I think, a comparable impact certainly in scale to Manning Clark's on this country. And in some ways, I mean, initially I thought a different kind of impact and character, but even there, the differences might be more superficial than the similarities. Both Ross and Manning, of course, have been significant, influential and visionary public intellectuals. Both have been animated by that vision of the good life, of the civilised society. Neither is a technocrat, and I guess we were reminded tonight that another man who wasn't a technocrat was John Maynard Keynes. What a splendid quotation that was at the end of Ross's lecture. Again, reminded of a vision of a good society and a civilised society. I think both Ross and Manning understood also in more specific terms that Australia would need to find its way in Asia. Manning was really, in some ways, a public intellectual pioneered that idea in the 1950s. And of course, Ross's work in that line has been so deeply influential over the last several generations now. And they also realised that Australia could not shut out the modern world. Manning's term, which he borrowed from Angus Wilson, was that we couldn't afford to be darling dodos. We couldn't afford to be darling dodos. And I think that Ross's public career and the words he said tonight have also been a reminder that Australia has to make its way in the world, that it can't basically shut it out. And I think that's an important message too, because the temptation to shut it out has been often overwhelming during the years of the pandemic. But in fact, Australia got through that pandemic in a lot of ways by not shutting it out. We very strategically kept those borders open, notably in terms of our exports. And in fact, the situation we're in now, as difficult as it is, would be a lot worse if not for that. Manning would certainly have recognised Ross as an enlarger, not a straightener. And he would also have admired, I think, the sweeping vision of Australian history that we've had tonight, that big picture from Beacon through Theodore, Scullin, the post-war reconstruction, Whitlam Hawke, right through to Albanese. And of course, Ross has also been, I think, very innovative in inviting us to rethink, in some ways, the periodisation of contemporary Australian history. And that notion of the dog days is one I've already relied on in my own writing, and I think it's a really powerful one, not only in its prescience for what happened next, but I think also in capturing that moment, sort of between the China boom and the pandemic. And I really do hope that others will take it up, because it's a really important idea. I appreciated the references to the Scullin government. I think a much underappreciated government, in my view. I don't think it was quite the dreadful disaster or failure that it's often been presented over the years. And I think that was hinted at in what Ross had to say tonight, that it was obviously overwhelmed by circumstance. But in many ways, of course, its instincts were broadly correct. I mean, its official policy, after all, was the Theodore Plan. It was, of course, it's the lack of cooperation from the Commonwealth Bank and from the Senate of the day that prevented it from pursuing that. And finally, I have to appreciate or express appreciation for all those references to the 1981 grand final. I remember it so well. Carlton was indeed 21 points behind with a few minutes to go in the third quarter. I would have been, about 12 at the time, and I decided that was the time for a kick out on the road with the football. I couldn't watch it anymore. It was too painful to contemplate what it would be like going back to school Monday morning to all those awful Collingwood supporters. But then, of course, something magical happened, and the magic was actually a great Rhodes Scholar, Mike Fitzpatrick, who took an extraordinary command of the game as Carlton's captain and ruckman. I've never seen a piece of leadership on a sporting field like it. In fact, I sometimes think of it in other contexts too. It was an amazing command performance from there to the end of the game by Fitzpatrick. And as Ross pointed out, Carlton won that game, much to Manning's delight, and I have to say, much to mine as well. Of course, Australia of that period was moving into a very deep recession, and Ross, of course, was so central really to, I guess, the kind of reconstruction of the country coming out of that recession of the early 1980s. So, look, I'd like to invite you to thank Ross in the manner that's become customary on Zoom. I always have to fumble for the part of, I think it's reactions it's under, that we normally use to applaud. But please choose your way to applaud Ross for a marvellous Manning Club lecture. Thank you, Ross.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, now I'm going to unmute everybody, and we've got a few minutes, and enjoy